I basically thought that I normally don't like doing slides or presentations, but I thought I would do just one slide to give people a little bit of a graphical visual on how I think the picture of the world looks going forward to 2050, and try to put it in a single slide. I think we have in our world two big trends. There's a trend towards globalization, and there's a trend towards technology. And so we have progress on globalization, progress on technology. The words globalization and technology are often used interchangeably and often sort of blended together. And I believe that little could be further from the truth, and that these are best thought of as extremely different kinds of things. And I would define globalization as basically moving along the horizontal axis. And you can sort of think of it as horizontal progress, extensive progress, and that basically globalization is about going from one to N. It is about copying things that work. And technology is vertical progress. It is doing new things. It is going from 0 to 1. You could define globalization as doing more with more. And so globalization is simply copying things that work and doing more of it. And then technology, in some sense, is doing more with less. And the question I want to pose, and I'll sort of give some perspectives on how I think people pose the question. I'll give a perspective on how people think about it, and then I'll sort of throw in a few thoughts of my own. The question I think that's worth posing as we think ahead towards the year 2050 is how much should we weight the horizontal dimension, and how much should we weight the vertical dimension? And that's sort of the very open-ended question I'd like to throw out to you. And I think if you think of it as a resource allocation question, they are different kinds of things to allocate resources to. As an investor, do I invest in globalization? So do I invest in building highways in China, or in setting up McDonald's franchises in India, or things like that? Or do I invest in technology, in trying to do fundamentally new things? As a philanthropist, do I allocate money towards helping people in emerging market countries do better? Or do I allocate money towards basic research and taking the best things in the world and making them better? And there are sort of all sorts of ways in which so you can frame it as a nonprofit, as a for-profit question. And of course, there's a political version of this too, where do we spend our resources on sort of getting the whole world up to the U.S. level, or do we spend our resources on improving the U.S. and making it a better country? I think that's sort of a very basic, a political version. Now, the glib answer, of course, is we're going to do all of these things, but I do think you can ask the question very much what percent of your time, resources should go into them. Should it be 50% globalization and 50% technology, 95 and 5? What are the different ratios? Now, it strikes me that the answer people have in our world today is that they are massively long globalization and massively short technology, just as a structural matter. I can sort of the simplest anecdotal way I can describe this is whenever people ask me for money in a nonprofit context, the easiest way I found to decline requests for money is to explain this chart, to explain the difference between horizontal and vertical progress, between extensive and intensive growth, between copying things that work and doing new things. Explain to people, I've decided I'm just doing new things. Now tell me what your nonprofit does. And invariably, they're always on the horizontal side. And so it's a great way to decline requests for money. And I think this sort of perspective is embedded in a lot of different things. When we think about how we used to talk about the world in the 1960s, we talked about the world as being divided between the first world and the third world. The first world was a part of the world that was seeing accelerating technological progress. And the view was it was just going to keep going. There was a bestseller written in 1967 by Zervan Schreiber called the American Challenge. And it basically said that if Europe didn't get its act together, it would fall further and further behind the U.S. The difference between Europe and the U.S. would grow from a difference of degree into a difference of kind. And that by the year 2000, according to Zervan Schreiber, the accelerating rate of technological progress in the U.S. would leave the rest of the world in the dust. People in the U.S. would no longer have to compete with other people in the rest of the world. They would be so far ahead of everybody. This would be reflected in the average work week in the U.S. People would work 7 hours a day, 4 days a week, and have 13 weeks a year paid vacation, all by the year 2000, as a result of exponential, accelerating technological progress. Now, we're always tempted to dismiss it. Well, he was French, and sort of have some sort of facile way to dismiss the sort of incredible optimism that existed around technology in the 50s and 60s, where things were going to continue to accelerate at a breathtaking pace. The way we speak about the world today is not about a first world and a third world. We typically speak about the world today in terms of the developed and the developing worlds. And the developing world is the world that will copy the developed world and that will catch up. And it basically, the sort of dichotomy in the way we speak about the world involves a convergence theory of globalization, that the whole world will converge on something like the level of the U.S. And so this dichotomy, unlike the earlier first world, third world dichotomy, is much more pro-globalization. It's a very bullish globalization dichotomy. But I want to also point out that the way we talk about it is implicitly an anti-technological dichotomy. And it's most hostile to technology when you talk about the developed world as being developed. Because implicit in, if you take that literally, you're saying that the developed world is the part of the world where nothing new is going to happen. It is done, and it is a place where nothing new is going to happen. And I think we have to be aware that this is the, if you want to sort of geographically situate this, probably the country in the world that most embodies the convergence theory of globalization would be China. And it is the country on which people are relentlessly bullish. It's grown at 8% a year for the last 30 or so years. If it keeps doing that, it will be bigger than the U.S. by 2023. It'll be bigger than the rest of the world put together by 2040 or so. But that's the one people are incredibly bullish on. The part of the world that perhaps symbolizes technology more than anything else, it was sort of an independent country, would be the state of California. And this, again, is a place people are structurally incredibly bearish on. There's always, there's always some things happening in Silicon Valley, but it doesn't seem to actually be enough to move the dial. And if you said California is this place where all this technology is happening, people don't really believe that. And it's not like, say, the 1930s when you had a serious recession, Great Depression, and people moved to California. Grapes of Wrath, they moved from Oklahoma to California. Today, people would be moving from California to Oklahoma, which it's probably not because technology is being developed in Oklahoma. And so there is sort of a sense in which I think the perceptions are that we are extremely bullish on globalization and bearish on technology. And my sort of the bias I would have is it really possible for there to be this sort of unbalanced growth in the 21st century? Can we have globalization without technology? That's sort of a basic one question I think is worth posing. And then moreover, why has this shifted? So let's start with the question: why did it shift in the way it did? How did things change so radically from 40 years ago to today, where people no longer believe in technology but believe in globalization as the great driver? And I think the sort of the pessimistic answer I have is that there's been much less technological progress in the last 40 years than is often advertised. With the important exception of computers, there has been general stagnation everywhere else. We have seen little progress on the energy front. In fact, energy prices, commodity prices are higher than they were at the peak in the 70s. The great green revolution of the 50s and 60s and 70s has started to fade. There's no longer improvements in agricultural innovation. And we're sort of living in an increasingly Malthusian world in which there's a struggle for resources because technology has not kept pace with global population growth. Biomedical progress has markedly slowed in the last 20 years. There are only about a third as many drugs currently in FDA trial as there were 15 years ago. The big pharma companies are starting to liquidate their employees en masse. And even when you come to something as basic as transportation, we're no longer moving faster. And it peaked with the Concorde in '76. That was decommissioned in 2003. And basically, today, transportation speeds are probably back to 1960 levels if you include very low-tech airport security systems and the way in which travel has become an increasingly nightmarish process. So I think with the one exception of the computer revolution, there's been tremendous deceleration. I have been involved with the computer revolution for the last 15 years. I think it has many reasons to believe that it will continue. There is an open question whether it is enough economically to move the dial. I don't think it's been enough the last 40 years, and you can look simply at median wages in the U.S., which have been stagnant since 1973. You can look at mean wages, which have gone up a little bit, so there's been some increase in inequality, but the basic reality has been stagnation. And I think the economic facts really call into question the sort of very optimistic technological story that often gets told in Silicon Valley. How can you have had 40 years of breathtaking technological progress when it's not translated into higher living standards in our society at all? So I think the reason for this shift has involved the fact that we've had 40 years of general failure in technology, and the question we have to ask as we go forward is, can this be extrapolated and can this be continued? And I guess just to sort of say a few words on my thoughts on it are that it's going to be quite hard to reverse the tech deceleration. It's something that's important to try. It's important to push the computer revolution further. It's important to try to reinvigorate all sorts of other areas. I think there are a lot of interesting questions why this deceleration has happened, but it's an important question for us to try. The one thing that I am, however, very convinced of is that the consensus view, long globalization, short technology, is simply wrong. That globalization without incredible technological progress is not going to work. And it is not going to work for simple reasons that we have, if you're on the sort of the more liberal side, we have environmental constraints. On the more conservative side, we have probably fundamental resource constraints. There are not enough resources, either or environmental resources, to sustain 7 billion people on this world at an American standard of living. And so if you have convergence in globalization without any technological improvement, you are basically just setting yourself up for relentless conflicts over resources of one form or another. And that's why I think the clean tech failure in Silicon Valley in the last decade is something we need to think about really hard. I think there was a lot that went wrong with these companies, but there's something about the clean tech failure as being more important than the Web 2.0 success. Web 2.0 success did create value, but the clean tech failure and the failure to develop alternate energies is what really calls into question the sort of globalization type of narrative. And when you see a world that's globalizing but not progressing on the vertical side, on the technology side, you start to have a sort of very different perspective on what's happening in many parts of the world. So just to give one perspective on the Arab Spring, and sort of all these questions: is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? And people often frame it in ideological terms around democracy is spreading to the Middle East, or it's this fundamentalist Islamic backlash. So you can sort of have sort of a positive or negative ideological take on it. But I think there's sort of a positive and a negative technological take. And the positive technological take is that it is the information age that is sort of helping disseminate information, and that it's sort of a success of the computer age that's coming to the Middle East and transforming these countries. The pessimistic technological case for the Arab Spring is that it was basically driven by runaway food price increases in 2011. Food prices had gone up something like 30 to 70% in the previous year, that the so-called Green Revolution is best understood as a result of the failure of the true Green Revolution of the 50s and 60s, which increased agricultural outputs, and that that we should not simply embellish it as this great transformational event, and we should not ignore the fact that it is sort of the direct result of desperate people who became more hungry than scared, and that is the kind of thing that you're going to be seeing more and more of in our world in the decades ahead. China cannot develop without massive technological progress. If China had the same standard of living like you have in the U.S., I don't even want to think what happens geopolitically. Who gets the oil? Who gets the resources? How does this possibly work? The 2008 to 2012 period saw oil prices were at $140 in the summer of 2008. What basically happened in the last 4 years is that a large part of the developed world got knocked out. You had massive economic collapse in the U.S. and Western Europe. China kept growing. Oil prices are now back to close to $140 4 years later, and we're once again running into the same resource constraint we faced 4 years ago. And the question is, who gets shot next in this sort of game of musical chairs? Is it a second Arab Spring? Is it Southern Europe that needs to get shot? Is it austerity in the U.S.? Is it a bubble breaking in China? Do people in India have to starve? These are the kinds of questions you are going to have to answer if you believe in globalization and you're not focused on technology. And so, while I am in many ways somewhat pessimistic about things, my pessimism does not stop me from believing that it is incredibly urgent to push the vertical axis really hard, because I believe that that is the only way we can navigate towards a more prosperous and successful 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.